What's life really like for a homeless family in New York? Lauren Sandler will be here to talk about her new book, This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. Which classic mysteries should you listen to on audio? Sarah Weinman will join us to give us her expert recommendations. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's May 15th. I'm Pamela Paul. Lauren Sandler joins us now from Brooklyn. Her new book is called This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. Lauren, thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So this book got a stellar review in our pages this week from Alex Kotlowitz. It's very exciting. And it's similar issues to the ones that he explores. This book is about a homeless mother. How did you get started on the project?
Well, I knew I wanted to write about homelessness. I've been writing about inequality and specifically gender inequality for a long time. But living in New York, the feeling of inequality all around us has been inescapable for so long. And I was really aware that it was an issue that had been getting less attention and not more. When I moved to New York in 1992, there were 20,000 people sleeping in city shelters, and it was considered to be a real human rights crisis. There were between 1 and 2 stories in the Times every day about homelessness. And now there are 70,000 homeless people in New York in pre-pandemic numbers. And it was like the issue had just sort of disappeared from at least the literary consciousness, if not a daily one. And I just felt it in my heart. So I wanted to find a shelter that would give me access and see if I could do that sort of old school immersion writing to give people a narrative that would grip them and bring them into an experience they wouldn't forget.
It's interesting you mentioned that time period from 1992 until roughly pre-pandemic, because for many New Yorkers now, they think about homelessness in terms of homelessness under Bloomberg, in which it seemed to disappear from the streets, and then homelessness under de Blasio, where suddenly it seemed to become once again a problem. But I'm sure that's a huge oversimplification and mischaracterization in many ways of the issue. To what extent did homelessness get better at all during that period, or was it always there and we just weren't seeing it?
Well, it was always there and it was being criminalized. So, Giuliani was quite famous for getting the homeless off the street, but it wasn't like he was getting them into housing. He was getting them pushed farther and farther out away from Manhattan. He was getting them into lockup. But the big thing that I think really happened was the surge in housing prices. It was hard to rent an apartment in New York, but it was possible. It was before rezoning under Bloomberg. It was before the luxury housing boom, before gentrification as we know it. And price gouging, not just in New York, but nationally, around housing became such an issue as wages were certainly not going up that it's become somewhat impossible. And, de Blasio ran on a platform of changing this. He's touted a lot of affordable housing, but that housing has been affordable for no one who's poor. And so it's been a real crisis for people like the protagonist of my book and millions of people like her, and now millions more to come.
Let's talk about that woman, Camilla. Who is she?
She is a woman who, when I meet her, is 22 and pregnant. She's from Corona, which is now known as the epicenter of the virus in Queens. And when I met her, she told me that she had a story to tell and we had instant chemistry. There's a real alchemy between us. I like to talk about how in nonfiction, there's always this notion, I think, that reporters and documentarians choose their protagonists, but in fact, it's really a mutual choosing. It's like any relationship. And she and I found each other. But amongst all the women at the shelter where I was reporting, she not just really connected with me as a personal connection, but also as an idea, which is that she was so organized, so disciplined, stunning, legally minded. I mean, she's someone who sued her parents for child support as a teenager and won. That kind of way of really, really understanding the system.
So this is someone who knows how to advocate for herself.
Beyond anything that almost any of her caseworkers or professors had ever seen. And so it really felt like if this is a woman who cannot succeed in this system, so she won't need to be in it anymore, who can't make the paperwork work and administrative burden work so that she can be free of this place that she was born into. It seemed to me that no one could. And I wanted to see if she could and how she could.
So was that part of the reason you chose her, to kind of show that here's someone who has tremendous internal resources, if no external resources or systemic ways to help, that even this person might not be able to succeed?
Exactly. And, I don't want to detract from what it means to not have the sort of mind that gets you admitted into John Jay for criminal justice, which is her story. There are certainly plenty of people, probably the majority of people, who are not in the system with such an apparatus to get out internally. But I did want to see what would happen in the best case scenario. And that best case scenario is still a worst case scenario for anyone.
I want to go back to this question of you choosing each other, because I think this is something that a lot of writers of immersion reporting, of narrative nonfiction, struggle with. If they want to tell a big story through the lens of a personal story or several personal stories, it's that question of how do you find that right person? And do you only choose one person, or because there are such specific circumstances to each individual case, do you go with 3 different people and interweave those stories? What was your process like? Did you know you wanted to find that one woman to tell the story, and did you try out other people at the same time?
Actually, the way it began was I wanted to depict life in a shelter. And there were 4 women who were eager to participate in that process with me. They're all in the book. But 2 things happened. One was the degree of connection that I felt with Camilla, the degree of intimacy that we felt between us. That was what was going to give the book its depth. And that's also, what was going to give me the experience of over a year with this woman I still am in regular touch with. I think that these narratives become something that can function as nonfiction novels, essentially, that can give you that depth of immersion and experience if you have that in the relationship to begin with. And so that was really key. I wanted to give people a read that would feel like fiction almost, except every single word was true. I'm a real reader of fiction. I'm a real reader of gripping stories, especially of women. And I wanted to be able to give that experience instead of something that felt like a homework assignment, instead of something that felt like a survey. So that's why I was focusing on a small group to begin with. But beyond that, there was this logistical question, which is that about a third of the way through the year, Camilla gets evicted from her shelter. And so all of a sudden, it wasn't about her as the center of a group of women in one place. She then was moving from a shelter in Brooklyn to an overcrowded apartment in the Bronx. And it became a question of, do I leave the shelter to follow her, or do I stay in this place, in essentially this stage set I had selected? And I decided to follow her.
So that really changed the nature of the book.
Completely.
How long did you spend following Camilla and her story for this book?
For the book, we agreed together that we would have this year in which I was reporting, and that anything happening beyond that year would just be available to me as someone who knew her and loved her. This is part of the book as well, is, I begin as a reporter in this environment, but of course, spending a year with this woman on such a regular basis, through such vulnerability, through such crisis, and also having a really good time together at times. We have a real connection. I, of course, began to care for her deeply. And so what it meant to have a relationship with her beyond when we decided the curtain would fall, that was crucial, that her privacy would be maintained after that point, and that she could just be someone in my life and not someone I was taking notes on or recording or preparing to tell the world about.
You bring up that interesting question that happens a lot with writers of books like this and reporters as well, which is that sort of tricky balance between being an observer and being a participant once you develop a relationship. And I'm curious if there were times where that felt difficult for you to sort of be at a remove. Did you have any kind of financial relationship with her? What were the complexities there?
Complex, I think, is exactly the word for it. I started off establishing some rules. Some rules were that I would not give her any money directly because I A, I'm a journalist, and that's verboten. I, B, did not want to influence or change her story in that way. The point of the story was to see how she could do it on her own. And I also, and this became the trickiest thing to maintain, I think, I didn't bring her over to my house because I knew that I was going to want to give her a place to stay, and my whole family did too. My whole family became very immersed in her life. My daughter, as I write in the book, learns what the word hypocrite means at age 8 when I tell her that Camilla and her son Alonzo cannot come stay with us. And so those boundaries served to maintain some distance. But beyond that, it felt anathema to me to maintain distance. She's someone who I care deeply about. And so in moments, for example, Alonzo, her baby, doesn't have a snowsuit, and it's a very cold winter, and I see his little feet freezing. And I know that Camilla has asked her absent father for a snowsuit for her son for Christmas, and I know that father is not buying that snowsuit. So I buy Alonzo a snowsuit, and I write about it. But I really believe that watching Alonzo freeze to death is not part of what I was looking to measure in this story. It was how she could really make her way through the system. And so having that clothesline to hang things on that really was about what are the constellation of factors that keeps this remarkable woman homeless, that kept me focused on what I couldn't interfere with. And it allowed me to sort of open a door to care as one person cares for another beyond that.
Let's talk about the constellation of factors that led to her being homeless in the first place. So you met her at age 22. She was living in a shelter. She was pregnant. She had lived in 29 places, I think, by that age. What was her childhood like, and how did she wind up in this shelter?
Well, like most people who are poor in America, she was born poor in America. She has a mother who has a number of children from different fathers and who was born in the U.S. to parents who were born in the Dominican Republic. Her mother has plenty of mental health issues and, didn't have the best models herself. Her mom was sent to the DR for an arranged marriage when she was 15 and knocked up at 16. And that was something that her parents intended to basically keep her mom off the streets. It's a tough way to begin life. And Camilla was the second daughter in such a situation. There are a number of children that followed after that. But a big difference between the stability of Camilla's childhood, which was still pretty unstable in Queens, and what Alonzo, Camilla's baby, would experience is that her mom had Section 8 housing. That means her mom had a voucher paid for by the government that basically is what scholars in the state agree are the thing to keep people from homelessness, to keep kids in the same school district, to keep some stability and continuity even in poverty. And in New York City, there has not been a new Section 8 case since 2008. And so Camilla has been experiencing her own early motherhood without even the elements of poverty that she got to have as a kid herself.
What happened in 2008 that stopped these Section 8 cases from moving forward?
The funding was just maxed out. And, I think 2008 is an interesting year to flag because for many of us, that was the moment that Obama started giving hope to liberals in America. But I want to add that this book was actually reported during the Obama era. Things were this bad in a Bloomberg, New York, and throughout the United States. And it's been actually a very interesting experience to report this book and write it through these rolling phases of America. I wrote this book imagining a Hillary Clinton era readership, and then there was a Trump era readership instead. I wrote this book imagining it was going to be released into a time of unprecedented prosperity. It was a book to shake people by their lapels and say, listen, this isn't a luxury boom for everyone. And instead, it's come out into a moment when in the past 6 weeks, over 20 million people have just lost their jobs. And so it's been a bizarrely prescient experience that I feel is more predictive than anything I could have imagined.
Before we get to the current moment, I want to go back and just talk about in a little more detail what the hurdles look like for someone like Camilla. If you are homeless in New York, right? And if you are not homeless and you're walking past the homeless on the streets, you might think, Why don't you get up and go to a shelter? Why can't you find housing? Let's just talk about why someone can't just get this fixed.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That is the big question. The reason that people can't get this fixed is because people cannot afford housing. There also isn't enough housing, and that is an issue that we see coming up in San Francisco and LA. It's also coming up here in New York to a certain extent.
All these luxury buildings keep going up, right? It's not like there
Exactly.
isn't space.
Exactly.
So, at what point, especially when you have someone like Bill de Blasio, who supposedly is coming in concerned about these issues, and even under Bloomberg, where you have a city that's absolutely booming and has the resources to do something about large-scale problems, like what is it that doesn't get done and that needs to get done?
What doesn't get done is policy that tells us that we're not going to price gouge housing. There's a guy named Daniel Malone who runs a homelessness organization in Seattle, and he said something a couple weeks ago that I heard on a Zoom call with him that I can't stop thinking about, which is people were incensed about price gouging hand sanitizer, right? When hand sanitizer was being priced for the highest bidder. And he said, why don't we have that outrage about housing?
Mm-hmm.
This is something that has been happening all along, where housing is only available to the people who can pay the most for it, always. And because of that, we have a human rights crisis in America. And the fact that this has not become something that voters are incensed about, or that, the blame is put on the person that we see sleeping in the street, that's something that absolutely blows my mind, because there are plenty of vacant apartments out there. There are plenty of opportunities to make stable shelter available for people. But the housing boom has meant that rent is simply inaccessible for so many people. The notion of affordable housing in New York, we have an affordable housing lottery where you'll get 70,000 people putting their names in for a single apartment. Camilla applied for 75 of these lotteries, and her name came up in one of them, which was almost unheard of. But even though her name came up, she couldn't afford it. And in fact, some of the apartments that she was applying for, she was a woman with a child. She was hoping for a 2-bedroom apartment. That's a pretty normative thing to expect for a person raising a child in one room, a parent in another. In the building where she applied, you needed to make $127,000 a year as a household for a 2-bedroom apartment.
And that's for housing that's specifically geared toward
affordable housing. Yes.
Wow.
Affordable housing in downtown Brooklyn. A studio in that building, you could not rent for less than $56,000 a year. Her welfare check pays her $16,000 a year. She supplements the rest with work study. It's impossible. And so this is the reason that she could not get housing. And it's not just because she's someone who was a student who had a work study job. Let's say that she was working at McDonald's. Half of fast food workers are still on welfare. Let's say she was doing childcare or home health care. Almost half of people who do that sort of work are also on welfare themselves. And so our low-wage work does not pay a living wage. Our rents are impossible. And this isn't true just in New York City. This is true around the country.
So how do minimum wage workers in New York do it? How do they get by when this is the kind of housing that's available to them?
Well, a lot of them live in overcrowded apartments. That's where Camilla ends up for a time. She is in the Bronx for a while with a family that moves into the living room to rent her the bedroom, and they all live in very crowded conditions. There are people who live with family, and frankly, there are many, many people in shelters. There are people who get pushed out of the city and still commute into the city to work, but even outside New York City, rents are crazy. There are people who crash on couches everywhere. But this is the one thing that Camilla, I think, really found as soon as she had a baby, is it's one thing to crash on someone's couch, as her baby's father does, at his sister's apartment where he lives while he goes to work at a restaurant and then goes to nursing school when he's not at the restaurant. You can't crash on someone's couch when you have a colicky baby.
Let's bring it up to the current moment and look first at the big picture. You mentioned, obviously, we know about the millions of people who are recently out of work. I'm assuming that we don't have updated homeless figures. And I'm curious also how well those figures are actually tracked and whether they reflect the reality. I mean, if you talk about something like poverty level and the way that's measured in America, there are lots of problems with the income level that they choose to measure that undercounts the number of people who are probably truly poor in this country and not making a living wage. Does a similar thing happen with homeless statistics?
It's very difficult to get accurate statistics, of course. It's easier in New York than other places because we have one of the rare right to shelter mandates, which means that we have a vast city shelter system where people can be counted. But beyond, say, the 60,000 a night that can be counted in city shelters, there's an estimated 4,000 historically on city streets who are counted in a one-night volunteer count. It's hardly accurate. We also have so many people who are just crashing in other people's houses. There's rarely a count on them. The census is sometimes helpful with that, but if you don't have an address to send a census form to, that's pretty tricky. And I think that we all know how many people actually filled out the census form in the past month when everyone was overwhelmed by other concerns brought on by the pandemic. That's certainly true, that way of life every day for people under the poverty line.
Did Camilla ever have to spend a night on the streets with her son Alonzo?
She has not. And it's interesting. There's a real class system that I noticed amongst the homeless around street homeless versus sheltered homeless. So the shelter where I was reporting is a shelter for homeless women who are either in their last trimester of pregnancy or have a baby under a year old. And that shelter is over a soup kitchen, which is run by the same organization. The homeless women upstairs refer to the people at the soup kitchen downstairs as the bums. The homeless women upstairs are people who would never think of themselves that way because they aren't street homeless. And in fact, most people who are street homeless are men. Most people who are street homeless are not women because of issues of sexual violence, and also because the majority of homeless people in New York and in many areas are single mothers. And the idea of being on the street with a baby is something that's really difficult. So in New York, part of the right to shelter mandate means that there's a place that you can go with your baby. In other areas of the country, that's a tent. That's a different situation. And so we're, on the one hand, very, very lucky here to have a legal obligation to provide shelter. On the other hand, these shelters are disasters for many people. There's a reason that we have street homelessness in a city that has right to shelter, and that's because those are the people who feel safer and healthier sleeping on the street than they do in our own city shelters.
Where are Camilla and Alonzo today?
So I want to be able to tell you so much about her now, but part of the agreement that I would have such full access to her life for that year was that I would protect her privacy beyond that. I edge into that a little bit in the epilogue, so I'm going to suggest that readers peel open to the back if they're curious about a bit of an update, but I will just say that for the moment, she's doing okay.
All right. Well, that's great to hear. I want to say again, this book has gotten a rave review from Alex Kotlowitz, who wrote the incredible book, There Are No Children Here, about children in public housing in Chicago, and then subsequently many other incredible prize-winning books. Editors at the Book Review have all been hugely enthusiastic about this book. So, Lauren, congratulations so much.
Thank you so much. I mean, Alex Kotlowitz, my God, right?
Yes. A very strong endorsement. Lauren Sandler's new book is called This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. Lauren, thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Pamela.
Every year, just as summer begins, the Book Review shares our list of the best books for the beach, pool, and summer getaway. But what happens when the summer we know is suddenly unknowable? Our next Book Review Live will be a special digital event happening Thursday, May 21st at 12:30 p.m. Eastern to look into what summer reading means this year. In the first part, I'll be talking with acclaimed author Ann Patchett about the joy of great stories in unsettling times and her role as reader, writer, and bookseller. In the event's second part, our very own John Williams will talk about great books for summer with Lisa Lucas, the executive director of the National Book Foundation, and with our critic Carl Sagal. This event is completely free. To RSVP, just go to timesevents.nytimes.com/bookreviewlive. Sarah Weinman joins us now. She is the author of The Real Lolita and editor of the forthcoming anthology Unspeakable Acts, True Tales of Crime, Murder, Deceit, and Obsession. Sarah, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
You are also the editor of a Library of America set of women crime writers from the 1940s and 1950s. So you're here to talk this week about classic crime on audio. Clearly, you have an interest in the subject, and I'm just curious when and how your love of crime fiction began.
I mean, I was reading crime fiction in high school, but I would date my real serious love of the genre to college, which would have been about the late 1990s. And most of that was then contemporary crime fiction. But when I eventually moved to New York and decided, sort of by accident, to become a writer, I found myself very interested in what I felt was this lost generation of particularly crime writing by women that weren't classified as the golden age of detective fiction. So writers like Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and Josephine Tey and Marjorie Allingham, but they also weren't like the classic hard-boiled American crime fiction by Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and James M. Cain. They were operating in this sort of third wave, more about psychology or dangers at home. And so these were writers like Margaret Millar and Charlotte Armstrong and a little bit of Patricia Highsmith, although I think she's sui generis in her own right. But they were writers who were doing something different that really not only spoke to me, but I felt that they were sort of the ancestors of contemporary psychological suspense. So I was putting together an earlier anthology of short stories by these writers, and it was right around the time when Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl came out. Mm-hmm. So fortunately for me, I had this great way of talking about this group of women writers, saying these were the women who came before Gone Girl, and you can't read psychological suspense that has come after without understanding the way that their books work and what their obsessions and compulsions were.
So you can really see these writers as the kind of antecedents to The Girl on the Train and the works of Gillian Flynn and all of these psychological or domestic thrillers, as they're sometimes called, that have been selling in the past 10 years.
Oh, yes. I mean, for the original anthology that I edited, which was called Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives, the subtitle was Stories of the Trailblazers of Domestic Suspense. And that term, even though it had been used a little bit, it really wasn't until I started using it in the context of these women who were writing from about the dawn of World War II to the start of second wave feminism in the early to mid 1970s. I really felt that domestic suspense captured what it was those writers were doing.
What do you talk about the golden age of crime fiction, Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers? What period is that exactly? And was what they were doing, those writers, different from this slightly later wave, or there's some overlap, I think, of women crime writers who are doing domestic crime?
So without getting into too deep a potted history of crime fiction, around the end of World War I, there was, I guess, this move partly because there was so much trauma between the end of a world war and a pandemic with the Spanish flu, that people, I think, were really looking for escapist reads, and writers were looking to also write in an escapist vein. And
Sarah, this is not potted history. This is like contemporary, this is current events, just a little earlier.
Isn't that always the way with history, that it turns out it's never in the past? I mean, I'm going to completely misquote Faulkner, but the past is not even past. So yes, you are correct. So Agatha Christie published her first detective novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, in 1920. And it was the first book to introduce one of her classic detectives, Hercule Poirot. And her books and many of her male counterparts, but certainly the ones who became most popular, who, as it so happens, were women, they were really interested in detection, in plotting, in sometimes in impossible crimes. It's also no accident that many of them became a little bit tired of conventional plotting. I always find it interesting that The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which more than 90 years later, it was published in 1926, it still infuriates people because of the twist ending. But the fact that it was published in 1926, just 6 years into Agatha Christie's career, also suggests that she was much more interested in playing with form and experimenting than perhaps she's given credit for.
We asked you for our audio issue this week to look at some classic crime writers and how they translate over to audio. So getting back to that past moment of reading for comfort and connecting it to our current, audio seems like, on the face of it, a great way to enter into this world of crime fiction or to enjoy it anew. I'm curious, were you someone who typically listened to audiobooks, to the audio versions of crime novels that you had enjoyed in the past on the page?
I'm a real recent convert to audio listening. That's a function of my own brain. I tend to read text very quickly, so I find that with audiobooks, most of the narrators can't quite match up in terms of speed to the way my brain processes text. That said, I'm also a podcast addict, and that's happened in the last few years. And with mixing of different speeds and different narrators, I think I've just become a lot more used to how audio is presented. So audiobooks are now a lot more easy for me to process. But I do find that listening to books that I've already read, for me, is a much richer experience than experiencing a book for the very first time. That said, for a lot of people who have trouble with text or find that they can't quite get into it, audiobooks are a wonderful conduit to get into reading.
I mean, it's interesting because with detective novels, with procedurals, you're often, when you're reading the book, kind of flipping back, looking for clues, right? What did I miss? Wait a minute, let me go back to this. And I'm curious if you find that the audio experience kind of changes that reading experience, because you can't really be turning back and sifting through and trying to be your own detective. You kind of are forced to continue with it as perhaps the author intended.
I mean, I'm someone who doesn't always flip to the end to figure out what happened. I like to read or listen in chronological order because I feel like I want to be surprised and I want to be carried along with the pacing and the force of the narrative, and I want to be surprised. So I think listening to audiobooks chronologically is a good way to do that. But I think there are also ways to kind of flip back and forth in terms of how the files are delivered, that you can go chapter by chapter and flip back and forth if you are that kind of listener or reader. I just tend to be more about the chronology.
Does anything still surprise you?
Oh, yes, all the time.
I would think that you were like the most jaded crime reader, that you would always know where it's going at this point.
I feel like that's one of the ways in which I know that a book really works for me, is that it does prompt that element of surprise. Even if I might think I know where it's going, to have that force, that jolt, it's still thrilling. Now, that said, even with heavily plotted crime fiction, I still tend to gravitate the most towards characters or setting or the written word sentence by sentence. It's no accident for me that if I reread a book, and I actually just finished rereading Josephine Tey's absolutely wonderful The Daughter of Time, there was a lot about the plot that I didn't remember, but I certainly remembered the characters like grumpy Detective Inspector Alan Grant laid up, and the fact that it involved the murders of the twin sons, and Richard III is thought to be the killer. So the fact that it's this meditation on history, that I remembered a lot more, but it was such a pleasure to revisit that book again. And while I didn't do that in audio, I think that's also one of the pleasures, that revisiting books can remind you of why you loved those books in the first place.
We gave you what I think of as a kind of plum, juicy assignment for someone who really loves a genre, which is that we said, tell us about some of the great audio out there on classic crime fiction, and really left it to you to decide which authors to explore, which books by those authors, which audio versions of those books to review. And you ended up picking 5 authors: Dorothy Sayers, whom you mentioned earlier, as well as Agatha Christie and Raymond Chandler, Patricia Highsmith, Margaret Millar, who's one of the writers in your Library of America anthology. How did you land on those 5? And if you could, for those who are new to the genre, tell us a little bit about them. And we can start with Sayers.
So I wanted to pick those 5 because I felt like they were among the best known crime writers around and who really represent the breadth and the depth of crime writing in the 20th century. So with Dorothy L. Sayers, she's someone who ended up becoming a classicist. She would translate Dante's Inferno. There are at least 2 books about her in various intellectual worlds. So she was just a fascinating figure in her own right. And she writes these detective novels featuring Lord Peter Wimsey that are kind of larkish, but over time they become much more complicated and really rich. But starting with Whose Body, it's just really fun and entertaining. And it was published in 1923. And you can really get a sense of why she wanted to write an entertainment. And then I think the next one that I talked about was Murder is Easy by Agatha Christie. And that's a little bit of, perhaps not a departure, but it's what we would now call a standalone. It wasn't a Hercule Poirot. It wasn't part of her other main series featuring Miss Marple. But I also thought that the audiobook was really fun and enjoyable and lively. And I thought that it might be a good entree into the way that Christie's wonderful, peculiar mind worked. I mean, she was someone who just created these outstanding, devious, outlandish plots. And it turns out a lot of it was just done by instinct, but she just had that knack, which I think a lot of readers and certainly a lot of writers could benefit from not only reading her, but taking her work much more seriously than they do, considering she is arguably the greatest and best-selling writer of all time.
Let's move on to the next in your piece, which is Raymond Chandler.
Raymond Chandler, he was American-born, but he was educated in England. And he bounced around a lot and really didn't find his way until he discovered these pulp fiction magazines and began to write stories for them. He worked in the oil industry and he was writing stories on the side. And this is how he developed his extremely romantic style detective, Philip Marlowe, who traveled the mean streets of Los Angeles. And so The Big Sleep is the first introduction in novel format. And when it was published, it created quite a splash. But more importantly, it was tremendously influential upon crime fiction as a whole, because just his language and his descriptions were not something that were customary in crime fiction. So he would follow those up, and the books would become increasingly more complex and labyrinthine, but also more character-driven. And he really still casts this amazing and permanent influence on the genre, to the point where decades later, people are still imitating him and view him as like the lodestar for how to write private detective fiction.
For a book like The Big Sleep, I would think there are multiple audio versions available. Did you pick the newest? How did you choose which one to go to?
I went with Ray Porter's, in part because I had heard really good things about him as an audiobook narrator from other works that he had done. And I thought that he was good, but as I think I mentioned in the piece, I just felt like his reading and his voice wasn't quite what I had envisioned for how Philip Marlowe might sound. And that's no disrespect to Porter at all. I think he's a supremely talented audiobook narrator. But it is interesting that the right narrator and the right book, it's so important, because readers need to be transported along with the narrative, and anything that takes them out of the narrative can be a fault.
I want to get back to that question of narrator because it is so fascinating and talk about the narrators of all five. But let's just continue on with these looks at the individual writers. Next on your list is Patricia Highsmith. Again, as you said, these are all well-known names, but a lot of people haven't read their work or don't really know much about what makes their work distinctive. So tell us about Highsmith.
Highsmith is someone who, as I think I mentioned earlier on, I view as sui generis. She isn't a detective writer. She doesn't fit comfortably in golden age or hard-boiled fiction. But in a way, she kind of stands outside of domestic suspense as well. Really, she is about obsession. She writes primarily male characters. Two of them are featured in Strangers on a Train and that now famous or infamous Bargain. And it's supposed to be a lark, but one man suggests killing the other's wife, and then he is supposed to kill the other's father. And so when one follows through, then the other gets caught up in this nerve-jangling tale of psychological suspense that really established Highsmith as a master from the get-go.
This is also, of course, an incredible film by Alfred Hitchcock.
Oh, it sure was. And that's the thing with Highsmith, is that so many of her novels translated so well to screen, even when the adaptations change a lot of it. And I'm thinking, of course, of the multiple films based on her Ripleyad, which are the 5 novels that feature Thomas Ripley, her sociopath protagonist. We first meet him in The Talented Mr. Ripley, and that's another classic Highsmith book.
Oh, wait, I have to stop you there. Do you have a preference between Purple Noon, the earlier French version of The Talented Mr. Ripley, or the Anthony Minghella film from the 90s?
I love the Minghella, but I think I do prefer Purple Noon just a little bit more, in part because Alain Delon, who plays Ripley in that version, matches a little bit more with my conception of how Ripley acts and really how he moves. Matt Damon does a great job, and certainly the cinematography of Minghella's version is just breathtaking, and Philip Seymour Hoffman and Cate Blanchett and Gwyneth Paltrow. I mean, the cast is just phenomenal.
Philip Seymour Hoffman alone, oh my God,
Yes.
in that movie. That's where his genius just became, for me, like completely clear.
I mean, he really owned that role. There's no question. I mean, ideally, it would be great to mash up both movies and create the perfect Ripley movie, but that's not going to happen.
Let's talk about the last person in your piece, Margaret Millar, because I think her name might be slightly less well known. I'm assuming you probably agree because you included her in your women crime writers of the 40s and 50s as one of those people who perhaps didn't have as wide a readership now as they ought to.
No, and what's ironic is that when she started publishing in the early 1940s, Millar sold quite well, and she was considered a far more successful writer than the man she married, who he was born and raised, and his real name was Kenneth Miller. And I must note that even though they were married to one another, they said their last names differently. He said Miller, and she said Millar. I don't know why, but that's something I feel like I have to note for the record. But readers wouldn't know him as Kenneth Miller. They would know him as Ross MacDonald.
And what was Millar's work like?
So Millar is very squarely in the domestic suspense realm. She did some detective novels early and late, but I think that her greatest and most exemplar work is rooted in psychology, in the domestic, in terms of really like women being gaslighted by men. This seems to come up again and again. And so Beast in View, which is the book that I reprinted in the Library of America set and the one that I discuss in the piece, it's really about a woman doubting her sanity and people not believing her. And she's getting these threatening phone calls, but she also is working through some unknown trauma of severe scope. And the way that it comes together, the ending has been copied a lot. So it may not surprise readers to the extent that it would have when Beast in View was published in 1955. But the force of what Helen Clarvo is going through and the quality of the writing really still make this book stand out.
Let's talk about the audio versions of all 5. Which for you was the standout among the 5 books that you wrote about?
I keep thinking about Bronson Pinchot's read of Strangers on a Train. I just felt like his voice and his reading and his acting ability really matched well with the tone and the pace of that novel. And as I believe I said in the piece, I would love to hear more Pinchot narrating Highsmith. I feel like that's just a really strong match of audiobook narrator and author.
Did anything surprise you in listening to these after having only read them?
I think surprise happens in terms of the passage of time. So a number of years had passed between when I last read many of these books in text versus when I was listening to them in audio. So some of the plot points certainly surprised me because, as I think I mentioned, I don't remember plots quite as well as I do characters or writing. But to have that conveyed in audiobook format, it made revisiting these books such a pleasurable experience. And I was grateful for that, especially in this time when it's so hard to take pleasure in much of anything. So we have to find it wherever we can. And certainly classic crime audiobooks were a way for me to do that.
I'm one of those people that still doesn't think of the 20th century as like deeply in the past, but you continue to read contemporary crime fiction. And while we have you, I just can't help but ask, who are the writers, the crime writers working today whose work you find most interesting?
I feel like there's so many wonderful writers that if I started to name them, I might get various people upset at me.
I asked it specifically in a way not to be definitive, so we're not doing the best. I'm just curious, like, who do you look forward to their next book among writers, crime writers today?
I mean, I always look forward to new books by Laura Lippman and Megan Abbott and Alistair Burke and Attica Locke and Elizabeth Hand and Denise Mina. And certainly some books by newer writers that really impressed me included Sarah Slygar's Take Me Apart, a wonderful debut novel that was just published in late April, and Elizabeth Little's Pretty as a Picture, which was her second book that was published in February. And from a few months back, I still think a lot about Your House Will Pay by Steph Cha.
Well, that's a lot to go on. Sarah Weinman, expert in crime fiction. Such a pleasure having you here to talk about this subject.
Thank you so much, Pamela.
Sarah Weinman is the author of The Real Lolita. Her forthcoming anthology is called Unspeakable Acts, True Tales of Crime, Murder, Deceit, and Obsession, and she reviews classic crime fiction on audio this week in the Book Review. Alexandra Alter joins us now from our Brooklyn bureau. Alexandra, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm okay. And books are okay too. I mean, a little bit, right?
Depends on where you are and whether you're a tiny independent store that's still closed or a large chain that's, opening up all of its stores like Books A Million is planning to do, and whether you're a big name author that's selling a lot of books or a debut author that maybe got a little bit lost in the calamity. But overall, the NPD BookScan numbers continue to be really solid. The unit sales of print books went up actually in the week ending May 9th, and they were up more than 10% over the prior week. I've talked to publishers about why they think this is happening in booksellers, and there is a really strong lineup. The publishers that decided to go ahead and publish into this pandemic are seeing that readers are still finding ways to get books, and they're still flocking to their favorite authors. So overall, it's looking pretty steady. Of course, there's concerns about what might lie ahead. But the other positive development that's been recent is, some large chains and even some independents are beginning to open their stores again in states where the stay-at-home order has been lifted. And this is sort of an interesting dilemma because it's a question of balancing the health and safety of your workers and your customers with the really dire need to keep your business alive. So you're seeing a whole range of approaches, even within a large chain like Books A Million or Barnes & Noble. They're having to tailor their approach to the state ordinances where they are. So in some cases, you can only let a certain portion of customers in. There's very stringent rules about how many people can be in a space. Some states are requiring that customers wear masks as well as booksellers. Other states are not requiring that.
What about gloves? I mean, I remember when I worked at Pete Dalton, like my little fingers were all over all of those books. We were constantly reshelving.
Yes, I think a lot of booksellers are requiring that their own employees wear gloves. And I was speaking to Kyle Hall. He's the co-owner of Interrobang Books in Dallas, which recently opened up to customers. And he said they have a box of gloves on the counter, and some customers are asking if they can wear them because it is an environment where you're picking up stuff and maybe not buying it. In the grocery store, you're not usually picking up a head of broccoli and putting it back typically. It's so there's different approaches. How do you sanitize books? So for example, in Barnes & Noble, they have these trolleys with signs that say, if you changed your mind or if you don't want that book, put it on the trolley. They take the trolley, they put it away for 5 days and then reshelve the books later.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think part, the signs are also communicating to people how far apart to stand and how to behave. But I think they're also signaling to people that it's okay, it's safe to shop here. And James Daunt, the new chief executive of Barnes & Noble, is pretty bullish about reopening the stores. And he feels like, with their spacious layouts, they're in a good position to reopen safely. But I did talk to other independent bookstore owners in states where they could technically open, according to what the local ordinances are, but they still don't feel comfortable because they're in these smaller spaces and they just haven't figured out how to do it safely.
I mean, it's interesting. I was looking at our new bestseller lists, which just went up, and there were a lot of new entries to the list. And perhaps that's because we have a lot of big name authors that people know they want the new John Grisham. They know they want the new Lawrence Wright. They know they want the new Scott Turow. So there are a lot of authors who maybe aren't as dependent on building that word of mouth who have books out right now.
I think that's exactly right. I think you're seeing, if you look at the list or Joanna Gaines, you're seeing people with a real following. Of course, Celeste Ng is a constant presence, and you're seeing books that have TV adaptations right now. But yes, I think there's signs that readers are looking for those authors that they love. They're not necessarily having to go and browse and get recommendations from booksellers or see something displayed at the front of a Barnes & Noble to find it. I guess the question is, what is happening at the mid-list authors or, the newcomers? And, those are the authors that are really dependent on visibility and hand selling and independent booksellers' recommendations. So I think there's probably going to be some residual damage done on that front.
One of the interesting things that you make me think of that I don't know if we've talked about on the podcast before, but you mentioned Celeste Ng, and Little Fires Everywhere is, of course, now streaming. It used to be back in the day when you had a movie adaptation version of a book and mass market paperback or TV adaptation. It's like the show would air or the movie would come out in theaters and then it would go away. But now these things have a much longer tail. And I imagine that then extends to the book where people are just going to be reading Little Fires Everywhere, which of course was still a bestseller without the TV show, but perhaps in perpetuity because it's never going off, it's never going off our screen.
That's right. I think, and somehow with a TV show, it has a longer tail, as you said, because people are coming in at different points. The episodes are still airing. And so the chatter continues like on social media or, in terms of reviews or news coverage of the show. So people get exposed to it over a course of weeks or months and come into it at different points. I mean, we've certainly seen that with major hits like Game of Thrones and things like that. But I do agree with you. I think a TV show just sort of draws out people's interest and it just keeps that book in the conversation for much longer. Whereas a movie, you're looking at a few weeks or really just, a short period of time where all the reviews hit and people see it in theaters and then it kind of dies down after that.
What book are you watching right now, Alexandra?
What book am I watching on television?
Yes. Are you one of the Normal People fans?
I haven't actually watched that yet. I have been keenly following all of the debate about it, though. And so that's interesting. I think I've mentioned to you before that I'm a huge fan of the Bodega Boys and Jesus and Mero. And while it's not a book yet, they are going to have a book coming out this fall. It was supposed to come out sooner, but it was delayed due to the coronavirus epidemic. So I don't know if that counts as a reverse adaptation.
You're preemptively watching the book that you will read.
And they've really figured out the quarantine formula. Somehow if it's not as good, it's nearly as good to see them talking to each other from their basements and places like that.
Well, I'm all for talking from our basements and closets.
Yeah, it's nice to talk under any circumstances.
All right, Alexandra, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Tina Jordan and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
It's always so nice to have you here, quote unquote, here. And Tina, this is your first time joining us for our new remote podcast.
Yes, and I, was challenged a little bit technologically at the beginning, but I figured it out.
All right. Well, we've missed your voice. We're dying to hear what you're reading. Why don't we start with you?
Well, here's the interesting thing. I feel like I've started about half a dozen books recently. The last one was MBS, the book on the Saudi royal family.
By Ben Hubbard?
Yes. And I think like a lot of people, having trouble getting into big, meaty nonfiction right now. And I have two kids, daughters in their 20s, who were looking for comfort reading and wanted to read with me all together some old favorites. So I think you'll be happy to hear, Pamela, that what we're reading right now are all the Saturdays books by Elizabeth Enright.
Oh, I love those books.
And we're about halfway through. And, I'm not sure that I reread them when my kids were growing up. I think I just handed them off and said, here you are. But for people who don't know these books, it's a magical series of 4 books by Elizabeth Enright. It's 1930s New York City, a family, 4 kids, a father, a housekeeper. You don't know what happened to the mom, but she's dead. And in the very first volume, the children have decided they're tired of having no money and they're going to pool their allowances every week so that one person gets all the money and can go out and do whatever they want. And I had forgotten how amazing these books are at evoking a time and place, but also seeming sort of universal. I mean, the kids are still really easy to identify with.
This is like the ultimate in free-range parenting, right? Because is it the 4-story mistake or the 5-story mistake?
It is the 4-story mistake, and then there were 5.
Right. Okay. So the 4-story mistake refers to this big brownstone that they have in the city, and the kids just basically run wild. Like there is no one watching them.
There's no one watching them. Like even the 6-year-old, when it's his turn with the money, like takes himself to Madison Square Garden to the circus. In later books where we're not yet, they move to the country and I think have even more freedom than they had in the city.
Elizabeth Enright was a writer for The New Yorker for adults, in addition to writing children's books. And I think the quality of the writing itself really stands out. She has another book that I also love, and I expect, Tina, you're a fan, which is Gone Away Lake.
Oh, right. Is that the one where the children discover an abandoned summer community?
Yes. And that has the tantalizing premise, which I think was the premise of a recent novel by Anna Quinlan, which is that idea of buried towns, that towns where they built a dam and the town went underwater.
Oh,
Right.
That's so creepy.
Right.
Yes.
I don't think I've read Gone Away Lake since I was a child, but in that book, aren't the houses completely intact with all the furnishings and the paintings and
Yes.
Isn't everything there?
Yes.
That's what
Yes.
I remember. Yes.
Yes. Now I know. I love it. And it has such a mysterious title. Those are the kind of children's books, that book in particular, that I hope that kids today continue to read because they move a little bit more slowly, but the power, there's still such suspense and tension in the power of that slow narrative. I hope that kids, in the age of much shorter attention spans and much quicker delivery systems for dopamine. Like we'll have the, patience to read through a kind of slow unwinding story like that.
I do too. I actually think they do. I mean, I know my own children did. I have to say, as an adult, I'm also finding going back to these at this particular point in time, very comforting. It's a nice thing to be reading right now.
All right, John, it's on you to make us uncomfortable. What are you reading?
No, I don't think I'm going to do that this week. No cannibals.
Cannibals?
Yeah, well, never mind.
This is what you've missed, Tina. Yeah,
I'll have to get the detail. I'll have to listen.
Those books sound comforting to me, too. I'd love to take myself to Madison Square Garden for the circus or a basketball game or something. I've been reading, it's funny Tina mentioned getting stuck in the MBS book, because I think I've mentioned the last couple of times that I've been sort of picking off short books and reading a bunch of them, which has felt good during this time. And then I thought, okay, I'm ready to transition and stop doing that. And so I pivoted about as severely as you can from that. And I picked up Simon Schama's History of the French Revolution called Citizens, which is a... Tina knows where this is going. Yeah. So, which is a book I've had on my shelf for years. And I've always wanted to know more about the revolution than just the broad strokes. And I think that this is a terrific way to do it. He's a very stylish, very smart writer. And I am going to finish it. But here's the caveat. I realized that I'm about 120 pages into it and absolutely loving it, but I never really feel like I have the time. It's not something you read 4 pages of as you fall asleep.
Right.
So I have a week off in a couple of weeks, the ultimate staycation, I'm thinking of it as. And so I think I'm going to just leave it where it is for now and then pick it back up then and really try. It's about 900 pages long. So I probably won't even finish it that week, but I'll at least make more progress. But it's terrific. I know I won't remember all the details, which I feel so bad about as a kind of, I wasn't the greatest student to begin with. And so I always have this sense of failing the material somehow if I couldn't pass a test on it. But it's one of those books that makes you want to read others about the subject. He gets into Talleyrand for a few pages and then you think, oh, I want a whole biography of this person, probably just because you're reading Schama on him. But so that was great. But then I needed something more doable. And
wait, before we leave Simon Schama, can I ask both of you, did you ever read An Embarrassment of Riches?
No.
That book is his history of 17th century Netherlands, Holland, and
tulip madness.
Yes. It's full of insanity. There's not only tulip madness, but there's this whole long, description of how the Netherlands came to be. And, when you think of that word, Netherlands, like the fact that it's not really land,
Right.
it's under sea level, and that they just basically created this country out of nothing, and the incredible engineering and technology that they had to do centuries ago without any of the tools that we have now is just mind-blowing.
I have to ask either one of you, did either one of you see a clip of Schama recently on television? I think it was on PBS, in his study, where you could see his books in the background. You
sent me a still photo of it, which was incredible. I didn't realize it came from a video.
I should say here that Tina Jordan is one of the masterminds behind our recent Snoopathon of famous people's bookshelves. So consider this perhaps an inkling of a part 2 to come.
There's so many books in his office or in his study, wherever he was interviewed, that not only do they fill the armchairs, they're in great teetering piles on the floor, and they're double and triple stacked on the shelves. It's an
almost
astonishing
looked like an
thing.
illustration from a kid's book or something about a person, because it doesn't look structurally sound, like it can't be real.
Yeah, no, it doesn't look safe at all.
But to Pamela's point, he is the kind of writer where I think right after this book, there's another big one called Landscape and Memory that I've been meaning to read much longer actually than the French Revolution book by him. And I feel like he could write about just about anything and I'd be interested in it.
I can't wait until the day when I feel like I can pick up books like that again.
Yeah, it's coming.
Yeah,
that day is
it's
coming.
coming.
And we'll go to the
know.
movies again, Tina, I promise.
Yeah,
I know.
you have to take a week off and have a vacation a la John Williams, which I feel like probably sounds like very few other people's vacations, John. Just like, I'm going to read about the French Revolution during my vacation.
Right.
And then I do just want to quickly talk about the other book I started because it's a writer I know personally and also admire a lot, which is our dear former colleague Ben Ratliff, who was a music critic for the Times for a long time and also one of the hosts of our Popcast podcast, which is a lot of fun. And it was always so soothing to hear him on that show. He's got a great voice. So I'm reading his most recent book called Every Song Ever: 20 Ways to Listen in an Age of Musical Plenty. And it's just this very charming in a Ben way. These chapters that sort of deal with very high concepts that he makes legible, concepts on repetition, slowness, speed, virtuosity, density. And he talks about different ways basically to listen to great swaths of music when you have all of this at your fingertips. And so I'm greatly enjoying that. Pamela, what about you? What are you reading this week?
You know, I actually did two of the things that you all did. One is I read a short book, and I also read something that is just purely entertainment and escapism. So I'll talk about the short book first, which is a book called The Cook, which came out earlier this year by Melis de Kerangal, and it is really short. This is truly, it's a half-day book. It's not even a day. It's a very small format, and it's less than 100 pages long. And I read her previous
It's fiction?
book.
I'm sorry.
It's fiction. Well, it's an interesting kind of fiction. So she's a French writer and really experiments with what a novel or a novella or a story can be. This book, The Cook, it's kind of more of an observation of a person. It's almost like a biography in a way, but really a biographical essay in which an unnamed person is writing about a cook, a young cook named Morrow, who teaches himself how to cook. And his start is kind of on and off. He's not one of those people that, like grew up snuffling out truffles in his backyard. He kind of came to cooking in fits and starts while he was continuing to get a master's in economics, but ultimately does become a chef. And it takes you into the kitchen of the restaurants where he works and what that's like. And she's clearly trying to question what it is that makes a novel in a similar way to, I'm sorry to bring him up again, but Emmanuel Carrere. It feels like nonfiction, even though you don't doubt that this person is wholly invented, but he could be real. And we're not really given any sense of what he's thinking or feeling. We're seeing him from the outside. So it's almost like she's written a very inventive form of journalism or personal essay, but not really about herself, but about another person. Her previous
Sounds like a
book,
fictional New Yorker profile or something.
It is. It's exactly that. It's like a fictional Bill Buford, kind of piece. Her previous book, I also read because it had such an interesting premise. It was called The Heart. And in that book, you follow a heart from the death of the person to whom the heart belongs in a car accident. And then you travel with the heart as it is transported, via helicopter to a hospital where it's then implanted into a new person, and then you follow that person. But the majority of the book is this very in-depth following the heart surgery. And I'm squeamish, but it didn't bother me. I just thought it was such an interesting way to frame a book. And that book I highly recommend. This one I liked as well. But The Heart I thought was truly an original and interesting book that just, you sit there wondering the whole time, like, what's going to happen to this heart? And what does this mean? That, like, what is she trying to say here about who this book is about? If it's about the heart, and the heart belongs to two people, and at a certain point, the heart belongs to no one,
Yeah. It's almost like a book about the soul.
Yeah,
Right.
It really is. It's a really thought-provoking book.
But is that sort of straight nonfiction?
No,
Like this
that's
is
also
actually
fiction.
I see.
And
I
that
see.
one actually felt more like a novel because you felt like there was a real creative structure to it. Whereas this one, you're sort of following this person's trajectory in all of its fits and starts and meanderings where he's like, will quit a job because he's annoyed that someone hurt him physically in the kitchen. There's a lot of violence in kitchens, apparently. And, someone hit him in a way that was just kind of considered par for the course, but that he took offense at and just walks out of the job. And so it's almost replicating the way in which a career works, that it's not always a straight trajectory, but it can meander and the person can question what they're doing. And so you're following that. And through her writing, she sort of evokes that state of, what am I doing with my life and what am I meant to do? That's very different from this other book that I read, which I also really strongly recommend. And someone just told me that it's especially fun on audio because Frank Langella, the author, reads it himself on audio. The book is called Dropped Names, Famous Men and Women as I Knew Them. And it came out a number of years ago. It got a nice review in the Times. It was a bestseller. And my husband had read it. And I was sort of looking around, casting about for what I wanted to read next in this weird moment we're in. And I thought, this is something that's just pure fun. I'm going for this. And it is. He organizes his memoir, if you could call it that, by chapters that are each the name of a famous person he has known. And he has known everyone. And he only chooses, with one exception, people who are dead. So he can give no offense to them, which is good because he gives lots of offense. He's super opinionated. And just to give you a sense of the range, and Langella, was known to many for his film work, but he did a lot of theater. So it includes everyone from JFK to Montgomery Clift, Tip O'Neill to Jackie Onassis, Raul Julia, Roger Vadim, Loretta Young, Oliver Reed, William Styron. I mean, you just think, who did this guy not know? I mean, I have to go on for a little bit. Tony Curtis, Dominic Dunn, Paul Newman, Anne Bancroft, Elizabeth Taylor, whom he dates, Princess Diana. It's like he's this Zelig-like figure. Yeah. And
that's amazing.
Yeah. And as hard as it is for me to stop naming names of chapters, it's really hard for me not to read 10 excerpts aloud, but I'm just going to read one. I might cheat. This is from his chapter on Lee Strasberg, who was the famous acting teacher of the Actors Studio. He hates Lee Strasberg, and it seems to be mutual. So this is from that chapter. Whenever in the same room with Strasberg, I avoided his sycophantic circle. The last time I was in his presence, he sucked the air out of the elevator we were riding in, and when we hit the ground floor, he put out his hand in a "stand back, I'm departing" gesture that caused me to laugh out loud. He stopped, looked up at me with pure hatred, and exited in a low-hanging cloud of fury. It remains one of my fondest sense memories. So he's just someone who says what he thinks. He gives it out. He'll take it. And I'm just going to tell one other really funny anecdote. I'm not going to read this one aloud, although I think you can tell from that excerpt, he's a good writer. He's a really good writer. He talks about when he first met JFK, he was working in New England at a summer stock theater. And I mean, he wasn't even in it. I think he was just doing kind of prop work. But he became friends with this other person on the crew named Eliza. And she said, "Hey, do you want to come over to my house for lunch with my parents and some friends?" So he says, sure. And he gets there and a servant answers the door, and it's this incredible estate. So he's sort of getting a clue that this isn't maybe what he might have expected. And the servant says, Eliza is not ready to receive you at the moment. She suggests that you go and have a swim. You can go into the cabana at the other side and find some bathing suits there. So he goes to the cabana and he looks at the bathing suits, and they're all 10 sizes too big. And he grabs one and he's kind of holding it up, because it doesn't have an elastic waistband so that it doesn't fall down while he's swimming. And as he is emerging from the pool, a helicopter lands, and who comes out but Jackie Kennedy and President John F. Kennedy. And they sort of stride up to meet him, and he's standing there wet, holding his bathing suit up with his hands to shake the president's hand. And this was his friend Eliza's way to prank him, knowing, full well that he would be caught in this way by the president of the United States.
I should say, since this is a literary podcast, well, first of all, that's such a great title for a memoir by an actor, Drop Names. But also, he was in a movie called Starting Out in the Evening in the late aughts, I think, which is based on a novel by Brian Morton. And both the movie and the book I would recommend.
Yeah, I think he's played writers a number of times, and
Yes,
we were meeting with his publisher the other day, and the publisher was saying, his editor, that he's trying to get him to write another book because many more people have died since this book came out. So he's got a lot of material, and I really do hope that he takes him up on that offer, because I cannot recommend this book enough. It's just pure fun. Let's run down the names of the books we talked about again. Tina.
So I am reading The Melindy Quartet by Elizabeth Enright. That's 4 books. The Saturdays, The 4-Story Mistake, Then There Were 5, and Spiderweb for 2.
I started climbing the mountain that is called Citizens by Simon Schama. It's a history of the French Revolution. And I'm reading Every Song Ever by Ben Ratliff.
And I read The Cook by Milis de Carangal and Dropped Names by Frank Langella. All right. Thanks so much for being here.
It was great to hear you guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.